At 54, 4 days after she signed the papers that ended a 26-year marriage, Hazel Drummond sat at the kitchen table of a rented room in Sudbury with $340 in her checking account, a box of her own things stacked by the door, and a key to a storage unit on LaSalle Boulevard she hadn't yet found the courage to visit. The key had come in an envelope from her lawyer along with a note that said only, "Contents belonging to the estate of your father, Raymond Drummond. Transferred per his final instructions." Her father had been dead for 11 months. She had not known he left her anything. She had not known, for that matter, that he had anything left to give. Before we go any further, if stories like this one find you at the right moment, take a second and subscribe to Ultra Stories and drop a comment telling us where you're listening from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Now let us tell you about Hazel. Hazel Drummond had been married to Kevin Marsh since she was 28 years old, and for the last 7 of those years, she had been sleeping on her side of the bed the way you sleep in a hotel, carefully, taking up only her half, trying not to disturb anything. Kevin was not a bad man. That was the part that made it so hard to explain to anyone. He was not cruel. He did not drink. He had never once raised his voice in a way that would have given her something clean to point to. What he was elsewhere, physically present in the house they owned in Garson, and somewhere else entirely in every way that counted. He golfed. He watched the game. He answered her questions about his day with 4 words or fewer, and then picked up his phone, and she had stopped, somewhere around year 19, trying to have a conversation with a man who had already left the room while his body was still in the chair. She had stayed because of the house, and because of inertia, and because leaving felt like an admission that 26 years had been a miscalculation. She was too proud to name out loud. She had stayed because her daughter Petra lived 40 minutes away in Chelmsford, and Hazel told herself she needed to be nearby, though Petra was 31 and entirely capable. And what Hazel really needed was to stop pretending a quiet house was the same thing as a peaceful one. She left in February. Kevin did not fight it. That was the last thing she'd expected, and the one that broke something open in her she hadn't known was sealed shut. That he let her go so easily, with the same forward energy he brought to everything else. Okay, whatever you think, 26 years, and that was what she got. Whatever you think. The rented room in Sudbury was $950 a month plus utilities. Her job as a dental receptionist covered it barely. She was 54 years old, starting over in a room with a bathroom down the hall, and a window that looked out onto a parking garage. And the storage unit key sat on the kitchen table beside her coffee mug every morning for 2 weeks before she finally drove out to LaSalle on a Thursday after work. She had expected boxes. She had expected his old fishing gear, maybe, or the woodworking tools he'd moved out of her mother's house when her mother passed and her father had gone to live in the seniors' residence on Berry Down Road. 2 rooms and a window that looked out onto a courtyard where the pigeons came. She had visited him there every Sunday for 3 years until he died. She had sat with him in the afternoons and brought him butter tarts from the Tim Hortons on Paris Street, because he always said the ones at the residence tasted like cardboard. She had thought, in those years, that she knew him. Retired postal worker, quiet man, widower. She had thought the full inventory of Raymond Drummond was something she could recite from memory. She was wrong about that the way you're wrong about a house when you've only ever seen the front of it. The unit was a 10 by 10, climate controlled. Paid up 2 years in advance, which she only learned when she spoke to the front desk. A detail that stopped her cold because her father had lived on a fixed pension, and 2 years of storage fees was not a small thing for a man who reused his tea bags until they were pale as paper. Inside the unit, stacked against the back wall in the order of someone who had thought carefully about how another person would find them, were 31 wooden crates. Handmade, the joints clean and fitted the way her father had fitted everything. And on top of the first crate, in a manila envelope taped to the lid, was a letter in his handwriting. "Hazel," it began. "I know you're going to open these boxes before you read this, that's all right. I would too." She had not, in fact, opened a single crate yet. She stood in the fluorescent light of the storage unit with the letter in her hands and read it 3 times, and then sat down on the concrete floor because her legs had made a decision her brain hadn't caught up with yet. If stories like Hazel's are the kind that stay with you, we'd be grateful if you hit subscribe before we go any further. What her father left in those crates is the part of this story we've been building toward. Stay with us. Raymond Drummond had been a woodcarver for 51 years, and his daughter had never once known it. That was the sentence that kept rearranging itself in Hazel's mind on the drive home, and then again all night in the rented room while the parking garage hummed outside her window. 51 years. Since he was 22 years old, since before he met her mother, since before Hazel existed. A whole life running alongside the life she thought she knew, quiet and steady and entirely his own, and he had kept it the way certain men keep everything that matters. Not with deception exactly, but with a particular privacy so deep it looks from the outside like blankness. The carvings were small. That was the first thing she noticed when she finally went back the next Saturday morning and opened the crates. They were not furniture, not the big obvious woodwork she might have expected from a man who kept tools. They were figures. Birds mostly, carved in basswood and butternut and the occasional piece of cherry, painted in watercolors so careful and particular that Hazel had to take off her glasses and put them back on twice before she believed what she was looking at. A chickadee on a branch so accurately observed she could see the gray graduation across the wing. A great blue heron with its neck drawn in, patient, waiting, each feather suggested rather than stated. A snowy owl on a fence post head, the eyes enormous and gold, looking at nothing and everything at once. There were 31 crates, and each crate held between 8 and 15 birds, and when Hazel finally did the count, sitting on a folding chair she'd borrowed from the storage office, she arrived at 312 birds. Her father had carved 312 birds, and she had not known, and she was going to need a minute. She went out to the parking lot and stood in the March air, which was doing that particular thing Canadian March air does where it hasn't decided yet if it's still winter or something else, and she called her daughter Petra. "Dad carved birds," she said when Petra picked up. 312 of them. They're in a storage unit on LaSalle. There was a silence on Petra's end. "What kind of birds?" "All kinds. Hazel, they're beautiful. Your grandfather's hands made things I never." She stopped. She hadn't meant to say your grandfather in that particular tone of voice, the one that comes from somewhere below the words. "I didn't know," she said. "I didn't know he did this. Did the letter say anything about why he never told you?" Hazel looked up at the sky, which was the color of old pewter and entirely non-committal. "Not yet," she said. "I haven't finished it." The letter was 4 pages, written on the backs of old Canada Post internal memos, the kind with the stiff header and the logo her father must have kept from his years on the route. His handwriting was what it had always been. Small, deliberate. The letters formed with a care that always made her think he was paying for them individually. She read the rest of it that evening at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea she forgot to drink. He had started carving in 1973 in the basement of the house on Regent Street, where he'd grown up, using his father's chisels and a piece of basswood someone had left by the curb. He had not thought much of it at first. He was 22, and working nights at the mill, and his hands needed something to do in the evenings when sleep wouldn't come. He carved a chickadee from the wood, badly, and his father had seen it on the workbench and said, and here his handwriting slowed, as if he was being careful with the memory. "You've got the patience for it, Ray. Not everybody has." His father was dead by the following spring, and Raymond Drummond had carved birds every winter for 51 years as quietly and consistently as he had done everything else. Because it was the last thing his own father had told him he was good at, and a man does not let go of a thing like that. He had never sold them. He had never shown them. He had given a few away, over the years, to people he thought needed them, and he named in the letter a woman named Stella Oakes in Espanola who'd lost her son, and to whom he'd given a carved merlin, because she'd told him once her son used to watch the merlins on the hydro lines on his way to school. He mentioned a man at the residence named Leonard who had grown up in Newfoundland and missed the Atlantic, and to whom Raymond had given a gannet with its wings set back, about to dive. But most of the carvings he had kept because he did not know what else to do with 312 birds, and because he was a man of his generation for whom making a thing was its own justification, and an audience had never been the point. He had not told Hazel because, and here, the letter took a long time to say what it was trying to say, crossing out, and starting over the way a man does when he knows the right words, and is afraid they're not good enough, because she had her mother's eyes when she looked at him. And her mother had always looked at him like he was a steady certain thing, and he had spent 50 years being the steady certain thing, And there was something in him that feared if she saw the carving she would understand that he was also afraid, also uncertain, also a person who needed something to hold on to. And he had not wanted her to worry, and he had not wanted her to see him small. She had thought all those Sunday afternoons with the butter tarts that she knew the full measure of him. She had known less than half. On the front of the manila envelope, in smaller letters below her name, he had written, "Look at the chickadee in crate 1. I made that one first in '73. I made the last one last October. 51 years is a long time to do one thing. I hope you can see it was worth it." Hazel went back to the storage unit. She found the first chickadee in crate 1, as promised, tucked in a corner wrapped in a piece of old flannel. It was rough in the way that first things are rough, the wing proportions not quite right, the paint a little uncertain, but the eye was exact. Even in the first one, even in 1973, the eye was exact. She held it in both hands and stood there for a long time. Then she drove to Chelmsford to see Petra. Petra Marsh was 31 and worked as an occupational therapist at Health Sciences North, and she had her mother's practical way of absorbing difficult information. She went quiet first, then asked the right question. When Hazel laid out the carvings on Petra's kitchen table, the chickadee and the heron and the owl, and 5 others she'd chosen to carry in a bag, Petra walked around the table without touching anything, and then she said, "Mum, these are extraordinary, I know. Has anyone else seen them? I don't know yet." Petra looked at the chickadee, the rough first one. He made this when he was 22, before he met Mum. Petra was quiet for a moment. "Why do you think he didn't tell you?" Hazel sat down at the table. She'd been asking herself that since Thursday, and she'd arrived at an answer that was still tender to touch. "I think he was afraid that if I saw something in him that wasn't certain, I'd be afraid. He wanted me to think he was solid all the way through. He didn't understand that I would have loved him more, not less." Petra picked up the snowy owl carefully. "Are you angry?" Hazel thought about it honestly. "I'm sad," she said. "I'm sad we sat across from each other for 3 years of Sunday afternoons and he never showed me this. I'm sad his hands made 312 beautiful things. And he kept them in a storage unit because he didn't want me to see him small." She looked at the table full of birds. "And I'm sad he died, not knowing that I would have thought he was enormous." It was Petra who found out about the connection to the soul. She did it the way her generation does everything, in 20 minutes on her phone while Hazel was making tea. And what she found was a small obituary in the Saw Star from a man named Gideon Aknipanescum, a Cree woodcarver from Garden River who had died 4 years ago, and whose work had hung in the Algoma Art Gallery in Sault Ste. Marie. In the comments below the obituary, a user named Raid Sudbury had written, "Gideon was the finest carver I ever knew. He taught me the patience of it. God bless him." Hazel stared at the screen for a long time. "He had a teacher," Petra said. "He had a whole world you didn't know about." She went to the nursing residence the next morning. The staff knew her still. She had been there every Sunday for 3 years, and goodbyes take time in a place like that. She asked the supervisor, a woman named Murray, who wore her hair in a bun and had a way of listening that made you feel the full weight of what you were saying, whether Raymond had had visitors other than family. Murray took off her reading glasses. "Come and sit down," she said. "I'll get us coffee. This will take a few minutes and it isn't mine to rush." She brought 2 cups from the nurse's station and set one in front of Hazel, and then she told her about the Wednesday mornings. Every Wednesday for 3 years. While Hazel had been visiting on Sundays, Raymond Drummond had been teaching woodcarving in the activity room. Residents but also staff, and eventually, once word reached someone on the 3rd floor who knew someone in the community. People from outside, a retired teacher from New Sudbury, a young man named Danny who worked at the hardware store on Regent, and who had found out about it he refused to explain. Raymond had brought his own tools. The residents had bought the basswood. It had never been an official program. It had been a man in his late 70s setting up at the activity room table. At 8 in the morning every Wednesday with his carving knife and a block of wood and letting whoever came, come. "How many?" Hazel asked. Mirel considered. "Over the 3 years, maybe 45 people, maybe more. He never wrote anything down. He would never have written anything down." She smiled, small and certain. "That wasn't him, did he?" Hazel stopped. "Did he ever mention me?" Mirel held her coffee cup in both hands. "Every Wednesday," she said. "He called you his girl who worried. He meant it with love. He said you'd worried about him since you were small. Since your mother was sick that first winter and he'd had to hold everything together. He said he'd spent 40 years trying to make sure you never had to worry about him again. She paused. He didn't always understand that some worries are love. That when you worry about someone, it's because you see them. He thought he was protecting you. He didn't see that you wanted to be let in. Hazel sat with that for a moment. The parking lot outside the residence window was the same one she'd looked at every Sunday, a full year of Sundays, and she had never known what was happening on Wednesday mornings in the activity room down the hall. She had been in the same building, 100 feet away, and he had been teaching 45 people to carve, quietly, on a Wednesday, and he had called her his girl who worried and meant it with love. He left me the birds, she said finally. I know, Mireille said. He told me he would. He said he'd thought about it for years. He said, and I remember this because I wrote it down, he said, I want her to understand that the quiet ones are doing something. We're always doing something. We just don't always know how to invite you in. Hazel drove home along Paris Street, and when she passed the Tim Hortons, she pulled into the parking lot and sat there for 10 minutes with the engine running. Then she went in and bought a dozen butter tarts and ate one in the car in the parking lot of a place she'd never go with him again, and cried in the way she hadn't let herself cry since the funeral, the kind that comes from a place you didn't know you had, for a man who had been doing something beautiful every Wednesday of his life and had not known how to tell her. She was okay. She was going to be okay, but she was also going to carry the Wednesday mornings for a very long time. It was 2 weeks later, when she had started thinking about what to do with 312 birds, that the call came from Kevin. Not Kevin, her ex-husband, that Kevin she had not heard from since the papers were signed and did not expect to. Kevin Lauzon, her brother-in-law, her late sister's husband, who had always been more family than her own family, and who called on a Thursday evening to say he'd heard from Petra about the storage unit, and he needed to tell her something. I knew about the carving, he said. Your dad told me about 6 years ago. I ran into him at Canadian Tire, the one on LaSalle. He was buying sandpaper, and I asked him what the project was, and he told me. He made me promise not to tell you. I'm sorry, Hazel. I kept his secret because he asked me to, and I think now that was wrong. It's all right, she said, and meant it. He was proud, Kevin said. Not arrogant proud, afraid proud. Afraid if he showed you and you didn't understand, it would mean something about who he was. His voice was careful. He told me once. I don't know if you know this. He said the reason he started carving was because it was the one thing he did where he didn't feel ordinary, where he felt like he was making something that lasted. He was a postal worker his whole life. He delivered other people's words. He said the carving was the place he got to say something himself. He delivered other people's words. She had not known that was how he felt. She had not known, sitting across from him every Sunday with the butter tarts, that he had spent 40 years feeling like a carrier of other people's meaning, and that the activity room on Wednesday mornings was where he finally said something of his own. She had been so sure she knew him. That was what hollowed her out. Not the grief which she had already learned to carry, but the understanding that she had spent 40 years of Sundays with her father, and never once asked him what his hands were doing the rest of the week. The thing that turned it, finally, was something small. She went back to the storage unit on a Saturday and opened every crate and laid every bird out on the concrete floor, all 312 of them, in rough chronological order, as best she could tell from the style and the paint and the dates he'd penciled onto the bottom of each one in his careful small hand, and she walked through them, slowly, from 1973 to last October, and it was like walking through a life she had not been allowed to witness and had now been handed all at once. The early ones were rough and searching. The middle ones, the 90s, the 2000s, were confident in a way that made her understand this, was a man who had been doing this long enough to stop being afraid of it. And the last ones, the ones from the final years when his hands had started to shake a little with the early Parkinson's the docs had caught too late, were something different. They were slower, more considered. There was a hermit thrush from 3 years ago that stopped her entirely. The curve of the wing not quite symmetrical, one side slightly lower than the other, and on the base in his handwriting, the imperfect ones are still trying. She stood in the fluorescent light of the storage unit and looked at the hermit thrush and understood something about her father. She had not understood in 54 years of being his daughter. He had known he was slowing down. He had known his hands were becoming uncertain, and he had kept carving anyway, and called the imperfect ones still trying, and left them in the crate with everything else, and meant for her to find them.
You've got the patience for it, Ray. Not everybody has.
She picked up the hermit thrush and held it. She had not been patient. She had been present. Every Sunday, every butter tart, every parking lot on Berry Down Road. But she had not been patient in the particular way. That means making room for what another person hasn't figured out how to say yet. She had waited for her father to speak, and when he didn't, she had assumed the room was quiet, because there was nothing in it. She had not understood, until now, that some rooms are full right to the ceiling, and the door is just harder to find than others. She kept the hermit thrush. She took it home to the rented room on La Salle, and set it on the windowsill where it looked out at the parking garage. And somehow that was the right place for it. She called Morel the following week, and asked if the Wednesday morning carving could start again. Not in her father's name exactly, not as a memorial. Raymond Drummond would have hated a memorial with his name on it, but as a continuation, as the door staying open, which was all it had ever been. Morel said yes before Hazel finished the sentence. She didn't know how to carve. That was the first problem. She had held her father's tools but never used them, and she understood enough to know that you couldn't walk into a room full of people learning something and fake your way through the beginning. So she did the thing her father had done when he needed to learn. She found someone who could teach her. It took 2 phone calls. The Algoma Art Gallery in the Soul put her in touch with a Cree carver from Garden River who had known Gideon Akneepaneskum and who was, she was told, the person who kept the tradition going. His name was Thomas Sayers, and he was 70 years old, and had the unhurried telephone manner of a man who measured time differently than most people do. She explained who she was and what her father had left and what she wanted to do. There was a silence on Thomas's end that was comfortable rather than empty. Your father knew Gideon, he said finally. Not well, but Gideon spoke of him. He said there was a man from Sudbury who drove up to the Saw 4 times to learn the finish cut. He paused. A man who drives 4 hours for a finish cut is serious. Gideon respected that. He drove to Saw Stain. Marie to learn carving, Hazel said slowly. She was doing the calculation, 4 hours each way. 8 hours of driving for a lesson he'd never told her about. And he never mentioned it. Some people learn privately, Thomas said without judgment. Some of the best ones do. She drove to Garden River on a weekend in April, on the north shore of Lake Huron with the ice barely off the bay and the light doing something it only does in the north. In spring, flat and white and somehow also warm at the edges. Thomas taught her the finish cut and 3 others over a weekend at his workbench, and he told her things about the patience of wood that her father had probably known and never found the words for. And at the end of the second day he put a chickadee in her hands that he said Gideon had made years ago and told her to keep it. Your father, Thomas said, walking her to her car, left those birds because he wanted you to know him. That's all it was. A man who is afraid to be known finds one way to be known anyway. You keep those birds somewhere people can see them, and you keep doing the Wednesday mornings. And that's the answer to every question he didn't know how to ask out loud. She drove home in the dark with the heater going, and the radio off and Thomas's words sitting in her chest next to the hermit thrush, and the letter on the old Canada Post memos, and the memory of 312 birds on a concrete floor in chronological order. A whole life she'd been standing at the edge of, and hadn't known enough to step through. She was not the same person who had signed those papers in February. She was not sure she was the same person who had sat in the rented room with a key she was afraid to use. She was something that hadn't had a name for her yet, and she was beginning to think that was not the worst thing. The Wednesday morning started again in May. She was not a natural teacher. She was too quick to finish people's sentences, and she had to learn, slowly and with effort, to keep her hands in her lap and wait. She had to learn that the point was never the carving. It was the moment when someone finally figured it out themselves, and you kept your face still and your voice low and you said only there it is. 2 words. Her father's words, she understood now, though he had never said them to her in so many words. They were Ada's words, handed to Raymond's teacher, and from him to Raymond and now to her. A small inheritance passed hand to hand through people who had taken the time to sit still while someone else was trying. The residents came. Danny from the hardware store came back and brought a friend. A woman named Susan came for her husband, who couldn't grip the tools anymore, and then found herself gripping them instead, and coming back alone the following week. A teenage boy whose grandmother lived on the third floor showed up one Wednesday and sat down at the table with the look of someone who expected to be told he was in the wrong place. And Hazel handed him a piece of basswood and didn't say anything, and he came back 7 Wednesdays in a row. She put the birds in the hall outside the activity room, where anyone who came down the corridor could see them. 312 birds in a long vitrine the residence administrator had sourced from a display company in North Bay. The hermit thrush was at the end, slightly asymmetrical, one wing a little lower than the other. The imperfect ones are still trying. People stopped. Visitors stopped on their way to see someone on the second floor. Staff stopped between shifts. An elderly man who barely left his room asked to have his wheelchair rolled past the vitrine on Thursday afternoons, and he would sit there without saying anything for 20 minutes, looking at the birds, and nobody asked him to explain himself because nobody needed to. Murray told Hazel on a Wednesday morning in July that 3 people had asked whether there were classes they could take. There are, Hazel said. Wednesday mornings. More than that, Murray said. Community, evening classes maybe. People outside. Hazel looked at the vitrine. She thought about her father in this building on Wednesday mornings, while she sat with him on Sundays, and thought she knew him. She thought about what Kevin Lauzon had said about delivering other people's words, and the activity room being the place Raymond got to say something of his own. All right, she said. Let's keep the door open. She had found the divorce papers when she moved out of the storage room in August into a small apartment on Elm Street, with a second bedroom she had already decided would become a workshop. The papers were at the bottom of a box she hadn't opened since February, under a scarf she'd forgotten, and a photograph of her and her father from the summer she was 9, standing in front of his first truck on a day she could not place. She remembered the truck, pale blue, one fender slightly bent. She could not remember the day. She sat on the floor of the new apartment with the divorce papers in her lap. And she thought for a long time about the woman who had signed them, the woman who had believed that a quiet house was a full one, and a silent man was a simple one, and that she already knew everyone she needed to know. She had been so certain. Certainty had cost her Sundays she could not get back, and a marriage that had emptied by degrees, and a father she had sat beside for 3 years, without once asking what his hands did when she wasn't looking. She had $340 in February, and now she had $340 more than that. And a room with a window and a workshop and 45 Wednesday mornings she was already counting. And 312 birds in a hall where people stopped on their way somewhere else and stayed longer than they'd planned. She put the divorce papers in the box she'd set aside for the recycling. Not with bitterness, and not with relief exactly. With the feeling you have when you set down something you've been carrying long enough that you forgot you were carrying it, and your hands are strange and light for a moment, before you remember what else you know how to hold. She found the letter again, at the bottom of the same box, in its manila envelope with her name on the front. She took it out and read the last page one more time. Her father's handwriting, deliberate and careful, the letters paid for individually. I know I wasn't always easy to know. I know I kept things close. I kept them close because I didn't know how to open the door from the inside, and I was too proud to knock and ask for help. A man taught me once that the patience to learn a thing is rarer than the talent for it. I should have learned sooner how to let you in. I hope the birds say some of what I couldn't. I hope when you see them you don't think, why didn't he tell me? There he is. That was me the whole time. I was in there. She had sat across from him for 3 years of Sundays, and had not known where he was. She knew now, and knowing even now, even this late, was not nothing. She went back to the vitrine on a Wednesday evening after everyone else had gone, and she stood at the end where the hermit thrush was, and she looked at the slightly uneven wing and the small penciled words on the base, and she thought about a man who had spent 51 winters making things with his hands and calling the uncertain ones still trying, and she thought that was maybe the best instruction anyone had ever left her. She was 54 years old, and she was not too proud to start. She turned off the lights in the hall, and the birds disappeared into the dark, and she knew they'd be there Wednesday morning when she came back. They always would be as long as she kept the door open. That was what Raymond Drummond left her. Not the 312 birds, though she would keep everyone. Not the tools in their roll of worn canvas. Not even the letter on the old Canada Post memos, though she would read it again every winter and find something in it she hadn't found before. What he left her was the understanding that the quiet ones are always doing something, that the still water has something underneath, that you cannot know a person by the face they show you on the days when they are trying to hold everything together, that a man can spend his whole life saying something in the only language he has, and if you don't speak that language, the silence will look empty right up until the moment it isn't. She had almost left Sudbury after the divorce. She had almost taken a job she'd seen posted in Hamilton, something steady, something far enough away, that she could start in a place where nobody knew the shape of her. She had almost chosen the clean distance over the complicated nearness. She drove past the residence on the way home. The lights were off in the activity room window. She knew the vitrine was in the hall, the birds in the dark, the hermit thrush at the end with its one lower wing. There he is, she thought. He was in there the whole time. She drove home on Paris Street in the dark, past the Tim Hortons where the drive-through light was still on, and for the first time since February, the silence in the car didn't feel like something taken away. It felt like something kept. Like something she had finally learned to be still enough to hear.